Welcome back to the channel, everybody. This is going to kind of be a breakdown of how I structure my React apps. It may not be the best way. There are probably a billion different other ways to structure React apps, and probably half of those ways are in some way better than the way I do it. But I wrote a blog about this, which I'm going to link in the description if you kind of like, written things. It may be a little bit more organized than this video is. Kind of breaking down how I think about React apps and how I organize them. And I actually stole this from another developer that I'm kind of working with right now, who writes just beautiful code just in general. And the way he kind of structured code was similar to this. I changed a couple of things, kind of to fit my general use case, but this is kind of how I break things down. So we're going to switch over to VS Code. And I'm actually going to be using a code base that I'm going to be using in another video that I'll probably release this week or next week on building a simple scraping dashboard. So let me open this up real quick in Terminal, and while I'm talking, I'll go ahead and install everything. So scrapeboard front end, and we're going to do npm install. So that should grab everything. So I wrote this in my blog, and I kind of explained the whole acronym. I think of all React apps in terms of STACS. And what STACS stands for is services, types, assets, components, and styles. So I included components in there only because it made the acronym a lot prettier, but basically I think of everything from a component-centric perspective. And I might be kind of reaching here, but that's kind of the way React, I believe, pushes you to go. So if you look within the source folder, I also included the GitHub repo down in the description as well if you want to kind of follow along in the code. It's nothing fun, it's nothing interesting, but it includes kind of all of the code from the front end perspective, and kind of you can walk through it on your own. So if we go into the components folder, I think it's kind of accidentally organized in a fairly decent way, kind of like going from most complex to least complex. But actually I think scrape table is probably the most complex. It has the most moving parts. You can look within the header.tsx, and it's just a header. All it does is say scrapeboard on it. So, obviously in real life, so let's do npm start. In real life, this would have a logo, like name, whatever. But as we're about to see, this is a very, very simple web app. And, already got some errors. Okay, I've got to install Axios. That's weird. npm install, yes. This is where kind of like your brand and all of that stuff would go. But obviously, since we're keeping things simple here, I'm only going to have like scrapeboard, and it's going to inherit some of these styles. So I'm actually going to fix something on the fly real quick. So I'm going to grab this, throw this in my style folder as react.css properties, and throw this in here. There's this weird thing with the way I kind of handle styles, and I'll explain this here in a second. So there's this weird thing with React to where it kind of like doesn't handle specifically like text align in the way that I am doing styles. And I didn't dig too much into it, but that's kind of, I guess, beside the point. Basically, this is how the finished app is going to look with no data. So you've got scrapeboard, scrapes 0, that's a counter that we're going to, kind of increment over time. Then you've got a button and a table. So I'm going to switch to face mode real quick because I've got to grab an API key real quick. Let's see. So basically for the backend, it's even simpler, and I'll show that here in a sec after I grab this API key. All it really does is grab weather for specifically Chicago, I want to say. But you need an API key from this weather account that I need to grab real quick, and then we'll be golden. I actually, if you look on the GitHub repo, I accidentally included this API key in my initial Git push. Was not supposed to do that. Big no-no there. But it didn't end up being a big deal. I could just kind of kill the API key and it was totally fine. I'm going to toss this API key in real quick. So API equals, so I'm using, let's see, openweather.org for the weather data. You just need a simple API key. Their API is super simple. They've got a free one. Let me walk you through the backend. It's like the simplest possible backend built in Fast API. If you want to learn more about Fast API, I've got a video that I'll link somewhere up there about Fast API, how to build in it, things like that. But basically, it grabs weather data and it throws it within this ugly-looking JSON thing, blob, whatever you call it. And the front end simply grabs from that through the API. So this is more or less simulating a database, like in the simplest way possible. So if we go to backend and we do Uvicorn, have I got that installed? Let's hope I do. I do. Uvicorn, and it's API app. That should get running. Nope. I've got install.env. Install, if I can spell right. Install. Oh, I'm hiding this with the camera, so you're not even seeing any of this. So I forgot to install .env, which is a library that this kind of depends on a little bit. It's python-.env, I think. pip3 install python-.env. Something like that. Yeah, there we go. So now we should be able to run it. Yep, all right, so we're running. Now we've got a backend running, and now we should be able to grab data. Yep, so we've actually got the data in here. So this is what the app looks like at the very end of the day. I'm 6 minutes in, and I haven't actually explained any of the structure. So we've got our header file. Let's go ahead and close the data. Don't need to save that. We've got our header file, and it imports style. So I do all of my CSS like in JavaScript. And I know it's going to be controversial because people use tailwinds, and I am just simply too lazy to learn tailwinds, and it kind of seems like a pain in the ass. So I write all of my styles myself, and I write them in JavaScript blobs and import them because that just works. And it may stop working later, and there are going to be angry commenters who say, this is how I do things, but this is how I do it. I import it as JSON blobs or objects, more or less, and I basically cast those as CSS properties. So like I said, header is the simplest implementation of the STACS kind of protocol because it just has a component and a style. There's nothing else to it. If we move back to stats, so let me walk you through on the actual front end. So this is the header. This right here, basically the button and the counter is in the stats component. So if we just go ahead and open up stats.tsx and we look at the return, we've got this div right here. It's got a paragraph component right here that actually prints out the scrape count. And then we've got the button that hits up the back end. And if we look up here, so our scrape count, this is the fun part. And I actually played around with this a little bit. The scrape count is actually being passed down from the app. And I'll explain why here in a second. But basically the app is keeping track of the scrape count, which is the amount of scrapes. So if we look over here, we've got scrapes 3. If we hit scrape again, scrapes 4, and then it adds another one down at the bottom. Apparently it's clear skied in Chicago right now. So app is keeping track of the actual count itself. And I guess I'll go ahead and explain why. Basically the scrape table needs the scrape count to basically keep track of whether or not there's a new scrape. So if there's a new scrape, then the scrape table component is going to reach out and grab that new scrape from the back end. If you're able to actually see all of the different calls to the back end right here, you'll kind of see that. So there's a call to increment scrapes right here, and that's going to actually reach out to the weather API, pull down the data, and then get scrapes is what is happening within the scrape table to actually get the scrapes themselves. And it's actually happening in stats as well. Not optimized, but that's kind of how it works. So if we open stats back up right here, you can kind of see this. So every time scrape count is called, it's going to go ahead and call get scrapes, and it's going to, wait. Okay, so that's just basically refreshing it to make sure that it's getting like the earliest form or the newest form of the scrapes array. And the clicker right here is what actually increments the scrapes. Now you're looking here at this increment scrapes. I'm just going to say increment. That is within a servicer. So the servicer right here is what has all of the functional code. And the way I kind of divide this up is basically this right here is all functional. I want to separate as much of my functional code from my UI code and my state code as humanly possible. Basically, I want my TSX files to just deal with the simplest possible form of the state and the UI itself. I don't want all of this functional code in here that's actually reaching out to the APIs and stuff like that. If I have an issue where I'm not hitting an API or an API endpoint isn't working, I know, hey, I don't need to, search within a component, which might be like huge. It might be like a much larger component. I don't want to search throughout the component. I know that it's a functional piece of code. So I'm going to look within this servicer kind of JavaScript file. And that's going to be where I know the problem is. So it kind of tells you exactly where the issues are going to be. It keeps all of the code kind of separated, and it keeps it a little bit cleaner. I could take all of this code right here, take it out and throw it within this TSX file, and it would work fine. It would just kind of make it a little bit uglier. Here within the TSX file, the only things that I am doing are the state tracking, the most minimal version of the functional code humanly possible. Like all I'm really doing is calling functions that are within the scrape servicer, and I'm returning my UI. This is a little bit more obvious within the scrape table component that we're going to go through in a sec. But I will go ahead and show you. I've also got my styles in here the exact same way. So if you look up here, we've got style.container. And I think that's the only style that we're actually using. Yeah, it is. So let's go ahead and look at the scrape table. This one basically contains everything except for assets. Assets are things like pictures and I guess data files and things like that for your project. I didn't see a need to really use those in this project, so I just didn't. But that would be things like pictures, kind of things that you would find within your public file. Again, I'm not using them in this, but, for a bigger, more full-fledged, web app, you'd obviously use them. So same exact thing here. I'm trying to keep as much of the functional code within my services files as humanly possible. So here you see me actually implementing the servicer right here. And all of these functions right here, the only thing they're doing is calling these service functions and then setting the state accordingly. So this temp scrapes right here, and we're going to see our first type here. It's a very, very simple type, so you don't have to worry about it. But it's basically just calling out using this, this servicer function right here. So if we go into get scrapes right here, that actually makes the call out to our backend API. It's going to print something out, which we really don't need it to do. And it's going to pull this down and make an array out of it. I could actually make this a lot simpler by just saying array of, well, no, I guess I don't really need to. So this is actually going to create that array of scrape objects that I've got right here. And if we look in our types file, we've got our actual type right here, our scrape type. So all it is a struct that basically has the time, the temperature, and the description that we're going to end up popping out over into the table. So basically what this is doing is every single time, let me open up the right file. Every single time that scrape count is updated, and remember scrape count is going to be updated by that button in the stats component. So this button right here. So every time this button is pressed, it's going to reach out to the back end. It's going to update the scrapes count right here, and that update is going to trigger an update in the table. And then the table is going to reach out to the same back end and update the table. Again, I know it's not optimized. I could completely remove at least one API call, but this is kind of just a simple web app to, kind of explain my thinking on the structure. And then it's going to use the map function to actually print everything out. So, couple of things. A, This is a dead simple web application, and it is probably not the best way to show a proper implementation of the way I think through these things. But I didn't want to kind of just wait around for me to like build out a proper web app in order to explain all this stuff, because frankly, I'm waiting for somebody to tell me I'm wrong. And if I am wrong, and I'm almost certain that I am, if I am wrong, then I'm going to change it. And then I'll probably put out another one of these videos saying I was wrong about the way I structure React apps or whatever. But basically, it's kind of a way of showing how you can structure these things to make them a little bit more organized and to kind of like organize your thinking around React apps. Otherwise, you just have a components file that is just full of TSX files, or a components folder that's full of TSX files. And that's just going to be ugly, and it's going to be hard as hell to debug, and you really don't want to do that. And this kind of also, it forces you to implement a sort of like file structure that makes sense, that you can also see within your imports. All of it kind of makes more sense to me, but I'm probably wrong. There's probably a different way to do it, and somebody's probably going to tell me what it is. If so, let me know. I'm excited to learn about the ways that I'm wrong, because I don't know as much about React as I want to, but I did want to put this video out to kind of explain my thinking. Like I said, if you want to kind of maybe get a more cognizant or, intelligent breakdown of my thinking here, you can read the blog that I've linked in the description. I wrote that and probably was a little bit more organized in the way I think when I did. So thank you so much. It's a 16.5-minute long video, and it didn't need to be, but I appreciate you watching, and I hope you learned something from this. Peace.